Chapter 14. Pacem. The promise of peace, prophesied by the German flyer that fell from the sky and ended its journey in Renoir's hand, seemed to hold. Nearly a week passed, and truly all did seem to be as well as it could be. Relieved, Renoir opted to attend to pressing business that he had left upon the back burner for far too long. He took to the road, leaving Leonie in charge of the house in his absence. The Saxon lieutenant colonel had agreed to Renoir's terms, and the girls continued doing a brisk, civilized business with the genteel German officers' corps, even in Renoir's absence. Meanwhile, Sebastian Strothman's company lazed in the August heat as they lined up for breakfast. Even at 7 a.m., there was the wet hot of Belgian summer rising up from the earth and joining the sun to tell them that this was not a day for wool field jackets and trousers. This was a day for swimming naked in the Rhine. But the Rhine River was not there to be had, only the Meuse. And the German boys were not there to skinny dip. A full work day lay before them. This was the 6th day in Liège, and they were getting antsy, but the loss of Captain Lannes meant they were on hold, awaiting their new commanding officer's arrival. The military bureaucracy was committed to retaining its strict hierarchy, so they were sending a man who outranked Sebastian, but he had not arrived. And until that occurred, the powers that be were content to have Sebastian and his charges do fatigue duty and police the civilian populace in Liège. Sebastian could feel the sweat soaking his lower back already. It would be a scorching day for certain. Moving men and materiel through their sector of the town would be a grueling, thankless event. He indulged a second cup of coffee from the company cook, tubby Heinrich Wilke, and sat back to savor it before the day began. The company was spread out in the field, lounging around the tents, devouring their breakfast, enjoying the last part of the day that belonged to them and not the army. Sebastian knew it would not be long before they would be in the thick of things in France. He was excited to face war again, but he would miss this place. Leonie. He could still taste her. The thought of her aroused him. He blushed deep red, trying to think away the blood that was rushing to his cock. It took some mental acrobatics, but he calmed it down, at least for the moment. When he first met her, it was on an introduction from Renoir. Taking her delicate, strong hand and brushing it with a kiss had been the unexpected end of him. Just touching her warm, soft skin aroused him, but he did his best to ignore the feeling stabbing at him. His brother Wolfgang had a saying, "It takes 1 second to fall in love. The rest is denial." It had never particularly been the case for Sebastian. For a man of his young age and station, he had enjoyed a fairly high number of exuberant affairs and sexual escapades. All had been good fun, and the partners lovely in their own individual ways. He had felt lust and desire and need of a woman, and yet nothing that he would define as love. However, his experience within the span of milliseconds that encompassed the first second he met Leonie, the burst of butterflies in his stomach, the tightness in his throat, the heat that flushed up his spine, into his shoulders, and down into his crotch, told him that this was different. Perhaps his brother was correct. "Cat's got your tongue?" Leonie had asked. Sebastian stared into her eyes for a long moment. In his mind, he laid out a string of reason. Number 1, she is a whore. Falling in love with a whore is stupid and pitiable. Number 2, she is a whore. Number 3, she is a whore. Try as he might, he could not find any other reasons not to fall in love with this woman, not one. Sebastian was nothing if not practical. He could tell that the short line of reasoning he came up with had no merit in the world as it was. After all, Sebastian killed people the previous day. The battle in the Belgian fort had not been like fencing with sharp blades and striking his fellows savagely in the lecture hall/Colosseum. It had been straight homicide. Of that there was no question. But it was not the killing in the fort that bothered him. After sacking the guns and capturing the surrendering survivors, they pressed forward toward Liège. When they paused near the outskirts of the city, they came under fierce rifle fire. 3 of Sebastian's men were shot and killed, Sergeant Hoffman among them. A large blue welt in his forehead, the backside of his head turned to bright red oatmeal. When they captured the small homestead that the riflemen were holed up in, they discovered that the gunmen were not in uniform. This was problematic. They claimed to be militia, sanctioned by King Albert I to defend their homeland. But as everyone knew, war had rules. These men were not in proper kit. They bore no rank or insignia. They did not belong to a section, platoon, regiment, company, or army. This was a violation of the strict rules of warfare. They had to be held to account. Per the laws of war, the 3 men were criminals of the worst sort. If Sebastian was being honest, 2 were merely boys, 17 at most, by his best estimate. Even so, the 2 boys and the man leading them had broken the laws of mass killing by virtue of their improper attire. Sebastian remembered his governess, Frau Witten, scolding him and Wolfgang ferociously for wrestling in their Sunday dress clothes. Improper attire was, apparently, even more improper as you became an adult. Sebastian had the 3 civilian snipers righteously strung up by their necks and hung until dead. Murder by hanging was even uglier than Sebastian thought it would be. The spasming and jerking lasted a long, long time. Bullets would have been faster and easier. However, leaving the men dangling, adorning the home's joists, send a clear message to the local populace that murder of soldiers by civilians would receive abrupt, violent, ultimate retribution. And so Sebastian recognized that he had most certainly become not just a killer, but a murderer on that day. He wondered in what exact world could a murderer look at a whore and pass judgment on her life. Unless there were things about her he was ignorant of, truth be told, there were many, but she had never killed anyone. How could he imagine himself somehow superior to her? And thus he fell in love with her. In the breath of time there was those first milliseconds of touching her hand, and there he remained. He had been with her every night for the past week. He paid her handsomely for the privilege. On the 3rd night, after he climaxed, they lay for a while in the bed, sweat-soaked and sated. It was then that he made his confession. "I love you." She burst out laughing, and so did he. "I know. It is ridiculous," he said through laughter-fed tears. "Truly," she replied, and they both burst into laughter again. She stroked the fine hairs on his chest and plucked one. Sebastian let out a small yelp at the sharp pain. That a harmless little thing like a plucked chest hair could stab so brutally was, in itself, terribly funny. She played with the yellow corn silk hair, twisting it in the lamp's light. "So, What will you do with all of this love, Bavaria? Will you save me from all of this? Take me away to your castle and cover me in diamonds? Raise me up in your tower so I may remain chastely yours and yours alone. He mulled it over. Finally, he found the words. No. I fell in love with you the moment I saw you. I don't want you in any other way than as you are. Why would I want you another way? This gave Leonie pause from her laughter. Dozens upon dozens of men had briefly fallen deep in love with her over the course of her 22 years. But this was the first time it came at her in this particular way. She knew that she could love him too. She had become a professional at 16. Alexander Renoir saved her from what would have been a short life on the streets of Paris 2 years later. She found him suspect at first, as she had learned to find all men. But her options were limited. He'd offered her a home to ply her trade, the lion's share of her earnings, and a measure of protection to go with it. Again, she found this entirely suspect, in the order of far too good to be true. But she accepted. She would later discover why his magnanimity had such largesse. Although it expanded his coffers, Alexander Renoir's true business was not in Leonie's skin trade. However, running a semi-legal, high-end house of ill repute gave all the cover he needed to run a much larger, covert enterprise without drawing too much undesired attention. If he had wealth, property, and goods, and it came via a whorehouse frequented by only the finest, wealthiest, most powerful men of the city, it could be assumed that being a fleshmonger was how he achieved his success, and so it was perceived by the Liège populace. Alexander Renoir was a sweet and intelligent, charming and aristocratic, generous and joyful seller of flesh, booze, and excellent tobacco. Renoir did not consider himself a pimp, though. He considered himself a trader. Smuggler was more apt. Judged by the actions of his associates and those who profited from his deeds, he could be called much, much worse. Renoir's family was filthy rich, and then they were not. His great-great-grandfather's head was lopped via the guillotine not long after the Bastille was stormed. Shortly thereafter, all the gold and property they had earned, taken, claimed, and stolen over centuries was seized by the new ruling class. A tragic state of affairs, or not, depending on which side of the table you were sitting on. The impoverished heirs to the Renoir name, if not the fortune, did what they had to do to survive. When Alexander Renoir travelled to France, to the hidden cellar that served as a way station for his business, he would occasionally wander to the last line of trees and gaze at the immaculate gardens, imagining his family walking the grounds of their vast, slave-built estate at Chateau de Bois, decked out in their powdered wigs and stockings, utterly perfume-soaked, devoid them of the stench of their unwashed bodies, playing embarrassingly competitive games of boule. Alexander was not wistful for that world. In no way did he regret that such was not his life. He much preferred the game that he was currently playing to the lawn bowling tournaments his ancestors enjoyed a century prior. Alexander's game was simple at first. He ran rum from the West Indies through Le Havre and skipped paying taxes on it by doling out cash in the hundreds to dock workers. Thus he could avoid outdoling thousands to the parasites at the customs office. He then smuggled it inland by riverboat. After housing the rum in the cellar at Chateau de Bois, he ran it across the border into Belgium, where he hauled it via wagon to Antwerp, then unloaded it on the black market at a healthy profit. Choosing to travel those types of roads led him to many an enterprising individual, none more so than Mason Ambrose, a junior quartermaster in the British Army. Mason loved booze and women on precisely equal footing. Alexander Renoir had the best of both worlds to offer his newfound global business partner. Mason's commanding officer had tasked him with acquiring a stockpile of rum rations for his kingdom's military and gave him a fair amount of capital to purchase it with. When he met Renoir through a mutual acquaintance and indulged in a long night at Renoir's house of ill repute, the two men came to a mutually beneficial agreement. Renoir would provide the Haitian rum that Mason Ambrose had been ordered to procure. He could sell it to him for a set fee that was well below the official purchase order's number. Then the two men would split the profit margin between them. It worked out quite well. In fact, by the time Mason Ambrose was garroted to death on Good Friday in the British supply depot by Harry Moss, he had over 400,000 British pounds hidden under his floorboards in Surrey. Over time, the pound notes would rot away into nothingness, along with the house. After all, it was simply paper, and paper was never bound to stand the test of time. The vast majority of that pile of fragile paper came not from Haitian rum. It came from British guns. The last Brown Bess, the muzzle-loading flintlock gun, which inspired Isaiah Taylor's scything tune, Black Betty, was fired by a British fusilier in 1838. It is highly unlikely that it hit or killed whatever it was aimed at, but it made a loud bang, bam-balam, launched a wobbly musket ball, bam-balam, and left a white cloud of exploded black powder lingering in the air. Bam-balam. Then the long gun metamorphosed. The smooth interior of the barrels that the Brown Bess musket's balls exited with a puff of smoke became rifled. Rifling the barrels set hard steel grooves vortexing up the barrel from one end to the other. In the newfangled Baker rifle-barreled musket, as the powder exploded, the gases expanded and sent the hot lead ball racing up the barrel. The steel grooves cut and guided its soft lead until it was twisting like a whirling dervish by the time the explosion drove it out of the barrel. The tight spin from the grooves made the flight of the little beast much more controlled, which sent the rounds out farther, faster, and much closer to where the musketeer wanted it to go. Warring with bullets became easier and decidedly more violent almost overnight. Old Bessie, with her smooth barrel bore, was retired and replaced by the Baker rifle, and then the Brunswick, and then in 1853, Enfield took over with the Snyder Enfield, which they converted from a standard muzzle-loaded Caterpillar to a cartridge-firing, rifle-barrel Butterfly. Soon after appeared the Springfield 1861, and her sister, the Springfield 1863. The pair spent years spilling a few million gallons of red blood onto blue and grey uniforms from 12 April 1861 until 9 April 1865, when the boys in grey finally laid down their rifles and flew up the white flag of surrender. That that was when things really began to hum. Henry O. Peabody, born and bred in new, not old England, invented a lovely little breech-loaded, single-shot man-killer, the Peabody rifle, and manufactured it at the Peabody Tool Factory in Providence, Rhode Island. This little darling perked up ears amongst the world's quartermasters. It was an engineering marvel and a thing of beauty. From the tool factory, Peabody rifles shipped out en masse to satisfy the desirous armies of the Swiss, the Canadians, the French, the Mexicans, and the Spaniards. Henry O. Peabody grew rich, fat, and philanthropic on the sales of his innovative man-killer. But technology was on the come, as the saying goes, and the Peabody breech-loading single-shot man-killer would not stay atop the mountain for long. Friedrich von Martini, a dashing Swiss gunmaker extraordinaire, leapfrogged Mr. Peabody. He made a knockoff of the Peabody, but added his own internal firing mechanism to it, then coupled a certain Mr. Alexander Henry's beautifully rifled barrel to it. The Martini Henry rifle was a smashing hit. The British Empire went bananas for it. The Martini Henry outfitted red-coated English warriors for 20 years, serving them exceptionally well, wherever their conquests of the local savages took them. And then the French turned it all on its head. In 1884, Paul Viel cocktailed up a chemical masterpiece: smokeless gunpowder, poudre blanche, white powder. No more puffs of smoke when the charge ignited. All the sound, all the fury, twice the firepower of the old black powder, but no blinding, choking smoke to go with it. Poudre blanche also provided a more controlled explosion. Thus the bullet continued to gain velocity the entire time it was twisting, spinning, and racing out of the barrel. Mr. Alfred Nobel patented his own version, picked an excellent marketing name, Ballistite, and made a mint or two. The new technology hit like a ton of bricks dropped from the fourth story. Then came the next piece of the miracle: the magazine. In 1888, the British launched their Lee Metford bolt-action magazine-fed rifle. Its 8-round magazine replaced the single-shot man-killers. 8 rounds, rapid-fired, turned a stout infantryman into a killing machine. Unfortunately, the Lee Metford still relied on black powder, which tended to foul up the poor barrels. Eager for the cutting edge of firepower, the British quickly replaced it with the white powder-fed, cartridge-firing, short-magazined Lee Enfield rifle, or SMLE, an apt abridgment. The new revelation in weaponry certainly brought a smile to the faces of the British generals. She was a 10-round magazine beast, flinging .303 caliber bullets with deadly accuracy to a range of well over 500 yards. A well-trained-up British soldier could rapid-fire 30 bullseye rounds in 1 minute. It eclipsed every rifle that had come before. The new tools poured out of the Enfield Royal Small Arms Factory by the bushel into army trucks. From there, they flowed out to the ends of the empire. But what to do with all of those quaint Martini Henry hybrids and the poor, short-lived Lee Metfords and all those Peabodys and Bakers, Brunswicks, Mannlichers and Mausers? Throw them into the ocean? Melt them into scrap? Bend them into plowshares? All these ideas were presented, but the one that took root was one that would make Mason Ambrose and his dear French-Belgian whoremaster acquaintance Alexandre Renoir very, very rich men. Sell these obsolete tools to the highest bidder. And so they did. Mason and Renoir bought every useless rifle they could lay hands on at a pittance, using the running cash they had accrued. Mason shipped the guns from Dover to Renoir at the docks of Le Havre in France. Renoir ferried them down the Seine by riverboat, offloaded them north of Paris, then smuggled them by land to his hidey hole in the woods beyond Chateau de Bois. They lay there and multiplied as Renoir gathered boxes and boxes of their breech-loaded comrades until the underground warehouse was filled to overflowing. Then he had them hauled by wagon into Belgium under cover of the night and ran them to the Antwerp docks for shipping. Renoir kept fastidious books. When all was said and done, they had rebirthed 128,626 rifles into the world. A pittance compared to the arms that the world's governments flushed onto the battlefields. For a two-man corporation, it earned a fortune. Under a French flag, Renoir's rifles traveled the Suez Canal to Djibouti, from Djibouti to the docks of Muscat in Oman. In Oman, modern alchemy turned them from lead, steel, and wood into cash, jewels, and gold. From there, the rifles tumbled out into the deserts of Arabia, arming the Rashidis and the Saudis and the Hashemites against one another. They trickled in a steady stream into Persia and Afghanistan, into Africa and India. New, happy homes were found for all the abandoned orphans of Europe's armies, and the proud new parents knew precisely what to do with their precise new progeny. Kill, kill, kill. C'est la vie, c'est la guerre. But these were not the things on Sebastian Strothman's mind that morning. The sixth morning of his love affair with lovely Leonie. He was looking past the day ahead to another night in her bed, while savouring Heinrich's fine-tasting coffee, when the bullet struck. It hit Corporal Doring in the throat. He fell back off the log he had been breakfasting on, his plate and coffee flying into the air in all directions, coffee and toast with jam and bright yellow scrambled eggs scattered to the wind. Doring sat up quickly, a funny look of shock on his face, grabbing for the wound that had torn through his trachea, choking on the blood. The rifle report reached them a millionth of a second later, and all the men of Sebastian's company scrambled for cover when Morse rounds hummed by as the rifle throwing them kept up its bark from the distant tree line. Sebastian crawled toward his wounded corporal. Doring sat back awkwardly and suddenly went all agog, wrists hanging limp, eyes unfixed, staring into the void. Just like that, he had crashed into a sudden dead end. When Sebastian reached him, he knew immediately he was past gone. Another of his men was hit in the leg and cried out. Sebastian grabbed Doring's rifle. He used the bolt action to chamber a round and stared through the sights, looking for the source of the sniper fire. Another man screamed as a bullet struck him, but whoever was firing had the blessings of Viel's Poudre Blanc or Nobel's Ballastite. There was no telltale burst of smoke when he fired, and thus no simple way to fix on his position. More rounds zipped in, driving Sebastian's men to the earth, desperate, more afraid than if a regiment had been coming at them full tilt. Sebastian shared their terror. But it was not specifically potential loss of his life that stirred the fear. It was the certain loss of Leonie, should he be killed. Her grin, her face, her hair, her scent, her skin flashed through his brains. Stuttering, cut fragments of stitched together silent black and white film. Loss of life now would mean loss of her. He did not intend to bleed to death in this field. His last experience of violent vacuuming of all the memories of the past 6 days, of all the hopes and fantasies he now had for the future as he fell into death. He wanted to live. Then Sebastian heard horses, and those horses were not oncoming death. They were salvation. 50 German cavalrymen, the 10th Uhlans, lances lowered and at the ready, galloped past, across the field, toward the trees that hid the shooters. It was magnificent to behold. "Follow me!" Sebastian cried out. He stood and ran, following the horsemen toward the woods. His company felt the same burst of mass mob courage that he had, grabbing their rifles and sprinting in his footsteps, driven to find and kill the men responsible for making shame-filled cowards of them all. The cavalryman successfully ran the culprit down. The sniper dropped the Martini Henry when he ran from the charging horses. 50 sprinted yards later, a stab in the back from a lance sent him tumbling and sprawling in a heap. The cavalryman wrangled him like a roped steer and brought him to Sebastian and his men, dropping his bleeding body before them. Felix Cornélie was slight for 15, slender and bookish, the shy apple of his mother's eye. His father, Philippe Cornélie, was the opposite. He was a boisterous, hearty, working-class man, proudly serving as a teamster, driving his pride and joy, a 4-horse cart, wherever he was hired to go. During the summers, Felix had accompanied his father on the buckboard as they hauled goods on the 3-day trek from Liège to the docks at Antwerp. Often as not, Philippe was in the employ of Alexandre Renoir, with a load of Arabia-bound rifles secreted in the wagon's Yankee bed. Philippe was a simple man. He was grateful to have an honest life where he could make a living doing simple, necessary tasks, using the strength of his own 2 hands. He also considered himself a patriot. When word spread that the king planned to send only a pittance of his army to defend Liège, Philippe, infuriated, had stood up immediately from the breakfast table, walked downtown with Felix in tow as a witness, and demanded to serve in the militia. It seemed a simple, necessary, honest, patriotic thing to do. The Germans killed Philippe during the first wave of the invasion. Sebastian Strothmann captured Philippe and strung him up, choking and jerking alongside the boys who accompanied him into battle. Philippe's only son, Felix, got word of his father's murder at the same breakfast table his father had left to join the fight. Felix found that he could not live with the loss. He settled on revenge. Felix was an excellent student. He did not have his father's physical prowess, but he inherited his mother's mind and possessed her gift for mathematics and rational thought. He used both to make his plan. It took 6 days to acquire the rifle, the ammunition, and the opportunity. In that time, he crafted his vengeance preparations with precise care. When all was ready, he unleashed it on Corporal Doring and 3 other men from Sebastian's company. When it was done, it made him sick to his stomach. As he dropped the rifle and ran from the cavalry charge, he was weeping tears of regret even before the hoofbeats ran him down and the Uhlan's lance impaled him. Sebastian and his company exacted their own revenge on Felix, but there was no patience or rational thought in the act. They beat him to death with their fists and steel rifle butt plates. They cheered as they dragged his broken body through the field. They laughed as they crucified him to the fence and hung a sign around his neck. It said simply, in broken French, "C'est fin pour tout franc tireur." this end for all guerrilla fighters. They left his young body there to rot. A week later, a new regiment arrived and put Felix in the ground. His stench and the visual were too much for any unblooded man to bear. Sebastian's new company commander, Captain Becker, arrived on the same day Felix was executed. Becker appreciated their conviction. He knocked them into shape and told them to be ready to march at break of day. If they wanted more revenge on these Belgian bastards, they could have it. They were bound for the city of Leuven, which was proving a haven of guerrilla fighters, just begging for a lesson in proper warfare. Captain Becker intended to burn Leuven to ash and give them one. That night, Sebastian went to Leonie. He told her he would not return again. He told her his love for her had turned him into a coward, and there was no way he could survive the war if he fought, fearing he would die and never see her again. Sebastian told her if he lived through the war, he would find her afterward, hopefully by Christmas time. She was stone-faced as he spoke. He was far from the first man to let her down. But inside of her, rage and heartbreak battled. With the next dawn, she heard the crisp stamp of Sebastian's company marching past beneath her window. She did not look out. He did not look up. Renoir returned from the Chateau de Bois that afternoon, driving his deceased employee Philippe's wagon, springs sagging under the weight of the rifles in the bed, the last of his and Mason's cash. As he reached the crossroads, he reined in the wagon team before Felix's ripe young wisp of a corpse. He stared at the boy's remains, his world knocked topsy-turvy. All would apparently not be well.